You want to buy this? The county clerk looked up from his desk, then back down at the paper, then up again. The way a man looks at something he wants to confirm is real before he reacts to it. Then the corner of his mouth moved. He didn't laugh outright. He didn't have to. The two people standing across from him were young, newly married, and holding everything they had left in a single envelope. The farmhouse behind him on the listing sheet had been sitting empty for years. The asking price was almost nothing. They were offering exactly that. Darius King was 26 years old. Imani was 24. They were standing in a county office in rural America with the kind of quietness that does not come from having nothing to say. It comes from having already made the decision before you walked through the door. They had driven 40 minutes to get here. The car outside had a crack in the windshield they hadn't fixed yet. They had looked at the farmhouse the previous Thursday. Broken windows, a roof that had given up in 2 places, land that hadn't been worked in longer than either of them had been alive. Imani had walked the perimeter of the property in her good boots and said 4 words on the way back to the car. "This is the one." Darius had not argued. He had learned in the short time he had known her that her certainty was a more reliable instrument than most people's careful calculations. The clerk stamped the paperwork. He was still smiling faintly when he handed it back. He would not be smiling in approximately 2 years when he read the name King Agricultural in the Regional Business Journal for the first time. But that was later. Right now, there was a deed in Darius's hand and 40 neglected acres waiting, and the only direction available was forward. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm bringing you a story of vision, sacrifice, and the kind of determination that turns nothing into something the world can't ignore. This is a journey from a broken-down farmhouse in the middle of nowhere to building an empire no one saw coming. If you've ever been underestimated, laughed at, or told your dream was too small or too impossible, hit that like button and subscribe, because in this story, the people who doubted them are the same ones forced to watch them win. Let me know in the comments, would you risk everything you have on something everyone else calls worthless? Now, let's go back to where it all began. The moment 2 people stood in a quiet county office and decided to bet everything on a ruin. His mother used to say that Uncle Emeka saw things before they arrived, not in the mystical sense, in the practical one. He was the kind of man who noticed which direction the rain was coming from and had already moved the grain before anyone else had looked up at the sky. He noticed Darius the same way, early, quietly, with the particular attention of someone who has identified something worth protecting. Darius was the sharpest child in a village that did not have much use for sharpness. His mother's farm was small, and the work was constant, and there was nothing wrong with that life. But Emeka had watched his nephew absorb information the way dry soil absorbs water, completely, immediately, with nothing wasted, and decided that a mind like that deserved a larger field to work in. He said as much at a family gathering when Darius was 15, and then, because Emeka was not a man who separated his words from his actions, he began setting money aside the following Monday. It took him 3 years to save enough to cover the first year of tuition and the flight. He presented it to Darius's mother on a Sunday evening, wrapped in the plain arithmetic of a man who had done the numbers and decided they worked. Darius was in the room. He was 18. He understood even then that what was being handed to him was not just money. It was a portion of a man's life, converted into an opportunity and transferred without ceremony or condition. He left for America 4 months later. The diagnosis came in his 2nd year abroad. Darius learned about it in a phone call that his uncle kept deliberately brief. The name of the condition, the assessment of the doctors, the information that treatment would be expensive and the savings would be redirected toward that. He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without drama, as though he were reporting weather. He told Darius to focus on his studies. He told him not to worry. Darius worried. He found work on a farm the following week, not because he had to immediately. He had enough for the semester, but because sitting still with that information felt like a form of negligence. He had his mother's relationship with land. He knew what to do with his hands when his mind needed somewhere to put his energy. Emeka died 14 months later. Darius did not make it back in time. He sat in a borrowed truck on the edge of Gregory Shaw's property at 6 a.m. and allowed himself 20 minutes with it, and then he got out and went to work. That was the whole of his grieving, in the visible sense. The rest of it he carried forward, converted, the way his uncle converted savings into a plane ticket, into something that could be used, into purpose, into the specific and unrelenting intention to make the investment mean something. He has not stopped making it mean something since. Gregory Shaw's farm was 300 acres of Midwestern flatland that had been in the Shaw family for 2 generations and managed for most of that time with the kind of stubborn habit that mistakes familiarity for expertise. The yields were acceptable. The losses were consistent. The operation ran the way operations run when no one inside them is asking the right questions. Darius started asking them in his first week. He did not do it loudly. He had not arrived with the intention of making himself conspicuous. He had arrived with the intention of keeping his uncle's sacrifice alive. And the way to do that was to work. But working for Darius had never meant simply executing instructions. It meant understanding the system beneath the instructions, identifying where the system was losing what it didn't need to lose, and quietly correcting it. He noticed the irrigation timing was off by a pattern that cost them moisture during the hottest part of the day. He adjusted it and said nothing about having adjusted it. The next week, the section he was responsible for was visibly healthier than the sections around it. Shaw noticed. He was not a man who missed things that affected his margins. Within 6 months, Darius had been moved from field hand to section lead. Within a year, he was the person Shaw called first when something went wrong anywhere on the property. By the time he finished his degree, attending evening and weekend classes while working full weeks on the farm, he had effectively been running the operation's most productive divisions for the better part of 2 years. The farm manager title came quietly, almost as an acknowledgement of something that was already true. He met Imani in his final semester. She was studying agricultural economics, and she had a way of engaging with an idea that Darius had not encountered before. Not competitive, not performative, but genuinely curious in a manner that made the people around her think more carefully than they had planned to. She asked him, in their second conversation, what he actually wanted to do. Not what his degree was in, not what his job was, what he wanted to do. He told her. The full version, the macro ambitions, the structural thinking, the belief that American agriculture had inefficiencies built into it at a policy level that someone with the right combination of field knowledge and systemic understanding could begin to address. He said it the way he rarely said it, which was directly, without softening it for the room. She did not blink. She did not smile the way people smile when they are deciding to be politely encouraging. She asked a follow-up question that indicated she had understood exactly what he meant and wanted to know more. He knew in that specific moment that he was going to marry her. He told her so on their 4th date with the same directness he brought to everything. She looked at him for a moment and said she had already figured that out. Then she ordered dessert. He had waited for the right moment, which turned out to be a mistake. There is no right moment for a conversation that the other person has already decided to end before it begins. Darius had chosen a Tuesday afternoon in late October, after a strong quarter, after a harvest that had outperformed the previous 3 years combined. The outperformance attributable, in ways Shaw was intelligent enough to recognize, to decisions Darius had made and implemented with minimal oversight. He had a folder. He set it on the desk. Shaw did not open it. He listened, or performed listening, which is a different thing, and when Darius finished, he leaned back in his chair and said the loan wasn't something he could do. He said it with the ease of a man declining a minor inconvenience. No explanation that held up to examination, no acknowledgement of the folder or the numbers inside it. The friendship, the version of it that Darius had believed was real, did not survive the sentence. He could see it leaving Shaw's face in real time, replaced by something more transactional and considerably less warm. The man across the desk was not the man Darius had eaten lunch with for 4 years. That man, it turned out, had been contingent on Darius remaining useful and stationary. He picked up the folder. He thanked Shaw for his time, which was the hardest sentence he said that year. He walked out. Imani was in the passenger seat. She looked at his face when he got in and did not ask how it went. She said, "Okay, so we do it without him." He pulled out of the lot. The drive home took 20 minutes, and she spent it thinking aloud, not catastrophizing, not consoling, but planning. What they had saved, what they could realistically acquire, what the minimum viable starting point looked like if they stripped everything down to what was necessary and nothing else. By the time they reached their street, she had sketched the outline of a beginning. The farmhouse listing had been sitting in Darius's email for 3 weeks. He had found it and set it aside as too small, too damaged, too far from where he imagined starting. He opened it again that night. They drove out to see it on Thursday. It was worse in person than in the photographs, which he had expected. The roof had failed in 2 places. The windows were gone. The land was overgrown in the way land gets when it has been left alone long enough to forget it was ever worked. Darius walked the full perimeter without speaking. On the way back to the car, she stopped, looked at the structure for a long moment, and said it. "This is the one." Darius looked at the broken windows, the sagging porch, and the 40 acres of difficult possibility stretching behind it. "Yeah, I think so too." They made the offer the following morning. They moved in on a Saturday, which was generous as a description. What they did was transfer their belongings into a structure that had walls and a floor, and in 2 of the 4 rooms, a ceiling that could be trusted. The 3rd room they covered with a tarp weighted at the corners. The 4th they closed off entirely and did not open again until March. The first week was the farmhouse. They worked on it before and after the land work, which meant they worked on it in the dark, by portable lamp, with the specific focus of people who do not have the option of hiring someone else to do this. Darius had watched his mother repair things all his life, with what was available, without complaint, because the alternative was a thing that needed repairing and stayed that way. He applied the same logic here. Imani applied it faster. She had a practical intelligence with physical problems that surprised him in the early weeks and stopped surprising him quickly because it turned out to be simply another version of the precision she brought to everything. The land was a different order of difficulty. 40 acres that had not been properly worked in years had its own opinion about being farmed again, and that opinion expressed itself in soil compaction, in drainage patterns that went nowhere useful, in the slow revelation of what the previous owner had planted and not rotated and left depleted. Darius walked the acreage every morning before anything else, reading it the way his mother had taught him, not with instruments first, but with attention. He took notes. He mapped what he found. He made decisions about which sections could produce in year 1 and which needed a season of recovery before they would give anything back. He planted 3 crops, not because 3 was the right number in the abstract, but because 3 was what the viable sections could support, what their seed budget could cover, and what 2 people working without hired help could realistically manage. He chose each variety the same way. Not for what he preferred, but for what the soil and the climate and the margin could bear. There were nights when the exhaustion was total, not the satisfying kind that follows a productive day and releases cleanly into sleep, but the deeper kind that sits in the body and asks quietly whether the effort is proportionate to the return. Darius felt it. He knew Imani felt it. Neither of them named it aloud, because naming it would have made it a question, and it was not a question either of them was prepared to answer yet. What they did instead was eat dinner, review the next day's work, and go to sleep. Then they got up and did it again. The discipline was not dramatic. It did not feel, from inside it, like the foundation of anything significant. It felt like another day of hard work on land that had not yet decided whether it was going to cooperate. Most days, that was all it was. They did it anyway. They kept doing it. That, it turned out, was the whole method. The disease moved through the region the way bad news moves, faster than anyone expected, and by the time most people understood what they were dealing with, the damage was already done. It started 2 counties over in early spring, a fungal strain that the county extension office had flagged in a bulletin the previous autumn. 1 paragraph, technical language, buried toward the end of a document that most farmers in the region had skimmed or skipped entirely. Darius had read it 3 times. He had then gone and found the academic literature it referenced, read that, and spent a Saturday in November cross-checking his planting plan against the conditions the strain preferred. He made adjustments that Imani noted without comment: additional spacing, a change in the rotation sequence, a soil treatment that cost them money they did not comfortably have at the time. She did not question it. She had learned by then that when Darius did something that looked like excessive caution, it was usually because he had seen something the rest of the room had not yet looked at. By April, the neighboring farms were showing symptoms. By May, the losses were being reported in the regional agricultural bulletin with the specific gravity of language that is trying not to cause panic while accurately describing a disaster. Farms that had been operating for decades were losing 30, 40, 60% of their expected yield. A farmer 2 miles east of them lost nearly everything. He came by one afternoon, stood at the edge of Darius's field, and looked at the crops without speaking for a long moment. Darius's fields were holding. Not untouched, there were sections that required intervention, mornings spent moving through the rows with the focused attention of a man who has studied a problem long enough to recognize its early signatures, but the preparation had created enough structural resistance that the damage remained manageable, containable, something that could be addressed without losing the season. The yield was not what he had originally projected. It was, given what was happening everywhere around them, extraordinary. The calls started coming in late May. Buyers who had contracted with neighboring farms and now facing shortfalls. Distributors who needed product and were running out of places to find it. The price per unit had moved significantly in the direction that favors the farmer who still has something to sell. Darius took the calls at the kitchen table with a legal pad in front of him and writing down numbers in his careful hand, and negotiated with the composed patience of a man who understands that the person who needs something urgently has already told you everything about where you stand. The first major sale closed on a Friday. Imani set the deposit confirmation on the table between them, and they looked at it together without saying anything for a moment. It was not enough to call them secure. It was enough to call them real. The regional agricultural network is a smaller world than it appears from the outside. By the end of that summer, the name Darius King had begun traveling through it, quietly at first, the way reputations travel before they become undeniable. People were asking who he was. The answer, when it came back, was always the same. He was the farmer who had prepared for what everyone else had ignored. He was the one whose fields held. He was, it was becoming clear to anyone paying attention, someone worth watching. Xavier Cole arrived on a Friday afternoon in a car that was significantly nicer than anything that had ever turned down their access road, and he stepped out of it in clothes that were similarly mismatched with the surroundings, and he looked at the farm, the fields, the repaired farmhouse, the organized outbuildings, the visible evidence of 2 years of relentless and intelligent work, and he stood there for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "Darius, what did you do?" It was not a question. They had met in the 2nd year of university in a study group that Xavier had joined less out of academic commitment than social instinct. He had a gift for finding the rooms where the useful people were and making himself welcome in them. He was the son of comfortable money, and he wore that fact without apology, but also without condescension, which Darius had noted and respected. What he lacked in formal education, he compensated for with a quality that formal education does not teach and cannot replicate. He understood people immediately, completely, and with a generosity that made them want to be understood by him. He was the kind of person who remembered what you had told him 6 months ago and asked about it specifically. In a room full of strangers, he was never a stranger for long. Darius had helped him survive 3 courses that would have otherwise ended his enrollment. Xavier had never pretended otherwise. He had said directly and without performance that he owed Darius something real, and that when the time came, he intended to make good on it. Darius had filed this away without attaching much weight to it. People say things in university that the years have a way of quietly retiring.
Xavier had not retired it. He spent the afternoon walking the property with Darius, asking questions that revealed he had thought seriously about agriculture as an investment sector, not as a farmer, but as someone who understood capital and where it moved and what it looked for. He asked about the yield projections. He asked about the equipment constraints. He asked with the directness of someone who has already done preliminary arithmetic what the operation could become with significant capital behind it. Darius told her. The full version, the same way he had once told Imani in a university common room, the scale he could reach, the market position available to someone who moved correctly in the next 18 months, the specific equipment acquisitions that would change what was currently possible. Xavier listened the way he always listened, which was completely. Then he made an offer with a number attached to it. Darius was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long. That evening, after Xavier had gone back to his hotel in town, Imani sat across from Darius at the kitchen table and looked at him with the expression she reserved for moments when she had already arrived at the answer and was waiting for him to catch up. "You're going to say it's too much to accept," she said. "It's a lot to accept. From someone who means it?" He didn't answer immediately. "Darius." Her voice was even, certain, the same voice that had said, "This is the one," in front of a ruin that everyone else had written off. "Let someone who believes in you prove it." He called Xavier in the morning. The partnership was formalized before the end of the month. The first piece of equipment arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Darius stood in the yard and watched it come off the trailer with the specific stillness of a man who was holding something privately significant together with his composure. Imani watched him from the porch. She did not say anything. Some moments are precise enough that commentary would only reduce them. The machinery changed what a day could contain. Work that had previously required the full hours of 2 people could now be accomplished in a fraction of the time, which meant the hours could be redistributed toward the acreage they had not yet been able to bring fully into production. The expanded planting followed within the first season. The hired hands came next. 3 at first, then 5. People from the surrounding area who arrived skeptical and stayed because the operation was run with a clarity and fairness that is rarer in agricultural employment than it should be. Darius knew what it was to work hard for someone else's vision. He ran his payroll and his scheduling accordingly. The farm became, in the course of that 3rd year, a business in the full sense of the word. Not just productive land, but a functioning enterprise with accounts and contracts, and a forward planning horizon that extended beyond the next season. Xavier managed the financial architecture with the same social fluency he brought to everything. He had relationships that opened doors, and the intelligence to know which doors were worth opening. Between his capital and connections and Darius's operational expertise, the combination produced results that began attracting attention from outside the region. The first industry invitation arrived in spring, a symposium on sustainable yield practices, a panel they wanted Darius to sit on. He read the invitation twice, set it on the desk, and told Imani about it that evening in the same tone he used to discuss irrigation schedules. She looked at him for a moment and then went and found him a suit that was appropriate for the occasion. The profile in the Regional Agricultural Journal ran in early summer. 2 pages, a photograph, the kind of coverage that circulates through an industry's internal networks and gets read by people who do not read general publications. It was accurate and thorough, and it named the farm, the partnership, the yields, the methodology. It told the story of someone who had built something significant from almost nothing, and it told it without sensationalism, which made it more credible and therefore widely circulated. Gregory Shaw read it. Darius did not know this for certain, but he knew Shaw subscribed to the journal, and he knew the profile was not the kind of thing a man in Shaw's position would miss. He allowed himself one moment of awareness, not satisfaction, not anger, just acknowledgement that the distance between that office and this farm had been crossed entirely on his own terms. Then he moved on. This was the discipline that the people around him would later cite most often when asked to explain him. Not the intelligence, not the work ethic, but the ability to register something and then refuse to let it live in him longer than it was useful. Shaw was not the point. Shaw had never been the point. The point was the farm, the work, the vision that had existed before Shaw and would outlast him entirely. Darius filed the profile in a folder and went back to work. The Forbes acknowledgement came without warning, the way significant things often do, not as the culmination of a deliberate campaign, but as the natural consequence of work that had become too visible to ignore. A researcher had been tracking emerging agricultural enterprises in the Midwest, and King Agricultural had appeared in the data with the kind of numbers that prompt a second look. The second look had prompted a call. The call had prompted a profile. Darius had answered the researcher's questions with the same plainness he brought to everything, and the profile that resulted was the kind that circulates beyond its original publication, picked up, referenced, forwarded through networks by people who recognize something real when the writing manages to capture it. His phone was different after that. Not unmanageable, but different. The symposium circuit expanded. He was no longer a regional voice, but a national one. Invited into rooms where agricultural policy was discussed by people with the authority to shape it. He moved through these spaces with the composure that had always been his default register. Not performed ease, but the genuine steadiness of a man who has sat with difficulty long enough that comfort no longer impresses him. He said what he thought. He said it clearly. He did not adjust his positions for the room, which made the rooms trust him more than the people who did. There were moments, in the margins of these events, when he was aware of being the only person who looked like him at the table. He noted this the way he noted most things, accurately, without drama, as information rather than injury. He had not arrived in those rooms to represent a symbol. He had arrived because he had built something that earned the invitation. He conducted himself accordingly and let the work make whatever argument needed making. The government inquiry came through a contact he had made at a policy symposium in Washington, a quiet conversation after a panel, a follow-up email, then a more formal conversation about a senior appointment in the agricultural sector. The kind of role he had named to himself in the abstract years before he had any reasonable basis for expecting it. He did not say yes immediately. He went home first. He went to Nigeria first, actually. He had been sending money for years, the uncle's children's school fees, his mother's household, the small dignities that money can restore when it arrives from someone who understands what it cost to be without it. But he went in person that autumn, and he sat in his mother's kitchen while she cooked, and he watched her move through her own home with the unhurried ease of a woman who was not worried, and he understood that this, not the Forbes profile, not the symposium invitations, was the thing that had actually mattered. He visited his uncle's children. The eldest was in her second year of university. She had her father's way of paying attention, that quality of focused, generous noticing that Darius had carried with him across an ocean and never lost. He sat with her for an afternoon and told her about her father, the real version, the man who moved the grain before the rain arrived, who had looked at a restless boy on a small farm and seen what he could become, and who had converted his savings and his faith into a plane ticket without ceremony or condition. She listened the way her father would have listened, completely.
Darius flew back and accepted the appointment. The appointment was announced on a Wednesday morning, and by afternoon his phone had filled with messages from people across every season of his life: former classmates, industry contacts, farmers he had met on the symposium circuit, people whose names he recognized immediately, and people whose names he had to sit with for a moment before the context returned. Xavier sent a single sentence that contained no words, only a string of numbers: the price per acre of the farmhouse property on the day they had purchased it, followed by its current assessed value. Darius looked at it for a moment and then put his phone face down on the desk and went back to the briefing documents. The role was everything he had named it to himself in the abstract: structural, consequential, operating at the level where policy shapes practice across an entire sector rather than a single operation. The kind of work where a well-constructed decision ripples outward in ways you cannot fully trace, but can, if you have spent enough years close to the land, accurately imagine. He had spent his career building the knowledge base for this. The fields had been the education, the struggles had been the syllabus. Every early morning on a property that most people had written off as worthless had been, without his knowing it at the time, preparation for a room like this one. He was not naive about what the work would require. He had sat in enough policy rooms to understand that the distance between good intention and structural change is measured in years and resistance and the particular exhaustion of pushing against systems that were not designed with change in mind. He was not deterred by this. He had built a farm from a ruin on 40 neglected acres with no capital and no safety net. He understood long timelines. He understood the relationship between preparation and patience. He intended to bring both. On the evening of the announcement, after the calls and the messages and the formal congratulations had settled into something quieter, he drove home. Not to Washington, home. Imani was on the porch when he turned down the access road. The farm was doing what farms do at the end of a day, settling into the particular stillness that follows productive hours, the fields holding the last of the light, the machinery at rest, the whole operation breathing in the slow rhythm of something alive and well-tended. He parked and walked up and stood beside her, and they looked at it together without speaking for a while. This was the land the county clerk stamped paperwork on with a faint smile. This was the ruin Imani had walked the perimeter of in her good boots and declared without hesitation. This was what 2 years of no margin for error looked like when the error never came, because they had not allowed it to, because they had worked with the specific ferocity of people who understand that no one is coming to do this for them. He had not gotten here on anyone else's terms. No sponsor's loan, no employer's grace, no version of success that required him to be smaller than he was, or grateful in the directions that would have kept him stationary. Every door that had closed had sent him through a different one, and every different one had led here. Imani leaned slightly against him. The farm held its quiet around them. That was enough. That had always been exactly enough.